Well, hello, everybody, and thanks for coming out tonight. This is a subject that I'm really passionate about, and I'm really excited to share about what the work that I've been doing and what I've been discovering. And, you know, holism is really the orient. I have a holistic practice as a naturopath. And like I was introduced, you know, I think about how humans suffer. Right, mentally, emotionally, physically, socially, and spiritually. And all those 5 domains are also how we heal. So when we're truly addressing somebody and bringing them into wholeness through holism and healing them, we're really needing to address all 5 aspects of those. And sometimes we'll get 2 or 3, sometimes we'll just address 1. You know, I think a number of medical approaches really just think about 1 or 2. They consider healing to be the absence of symptoms. And we know that it's much deeper than that. That you don't have to have any physical symptoms and you can still suffer immensely, for example. So not 1, not 2 is sort of a little foreshadowing. It's a non-dual slogan. And it refers to, I'm not going to be talking about monism, and I'm not going to be talking about dualism. I'm going to be talking about this both and, this place that's in between what is human, what is uniquely human, and what is divine in each of us. And that interface between the two that we carry, that both and. So the intro that I sent out, I wanted to bring Rilke into this, who I really consider to be a mystic poet, and I wanted to use Joanna Macy's translation because that was a huge loss last year, that she died, and her depth, deep ecology, and the way she thought about the world and our interconnectedness. And the mystical experience, I think, is really stated well in this poem. I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. I may not ever complete the last one, but I give myself to it. I circle around God, that primordial tower. I have been circling for thousands of years, and still, I still don't know. Am I a falcon? Am I a storm or a great song? Kind of resting in that not knowing space. I also want to say that I don't consider myself a mystic. I don't consider myself a shaman. I'm a holistic doctor who's had a meditation practice nearly every day for the last 30 years, and I really value that part of my day and its importance in how I am with people, how I am with myself, how I am with this world. All right, so a brief outline of what I want to talk about today. When I think about holism, I think about becoming whole. And part of that is radically accepting all parts of us, even the parts that we'd rather push away and make into shadow. When there's aversion to a part of who we are, when there's a collapse into a part of who we are, or when there's a dissociation from who we are, there's suffering. And ultimately, that radical self-acceptance lends itself to being fully human, right here, with whatever is arising in our experience. And I see that as the basis for healing, is really being present with this moment, whatever it is, whatever reality has to bring us, can we bow to reality and be with it? I want to talk about the separate self structures that are often born of suffering and trauma. And when I use the word trauma, because I think it can be a little bit of an overused word today, I'm talking about both capital T trauma and middle case T trauma and lowercase t trauma. There's a lot of suffering in this life. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of sadness. There's a lot of loss. There's a lot of grief. And how do we work with that suffering? How do we work with those traumas? And how do we heal? And I'll talk a little bit about what a separate self structure is, and I'm juxtaposing that with our authentic self, our true self, the core of us that's able to connect with these mystical experiences. I'm going to provide a couple definitions of mysticism using Paul Tillich, who was a German-American theologian, and William James, who was an American psychologist from the 19th and early 20th century. And it was William James's work that inspired the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, which researchers from Johns Hopkins, from NYU, UCLA, all over the world really, have used to assess whether somebody who's had an occasioned mystical experience, whether that qualifies via research as a mystical experience or not. What are the qualities of that are induced, and how do we define that? I also, hopefully I'll have time to do this, but I also want to talk about, when I go through each of the aspects, domains of the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, I'm going to try to use some case examples from my own practice. If we have time, I want to mention the shadow of this. There is, I think, a dark side and an unconscious drive sometimes to try to grasp a mystical experience. And I think that can really be problematic. That we need to be clear about the underbelly of this, and grasping after these experiences, if it's happening too much, can be problematic and not very healing. And then I want to tie it all together at the end. Transmuting altered states into altered traits is one of the slogans in this field. Closing and questions. So this is the psychological framework that I use with my work is a form of psychology that's become very popular in the field that I'm in, called internal family systems. That's what IFS stands for. And there's 3 psychological models right now. Internal family systems, acceptance commitment therapy, which is Stephen Hayes' work, and DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. And what each 3 of these psychological models has in common is that they rely on mindfulness. We need to understand, what we're experiencing, what are we thinking, what are we feeling, when are we beside ourselves in terms of engaged with our separate self structure, and when are we truly embodied present awareness inside of who we really are. And so the multiplicity of the human experience points to none of us are mono-minds, right? There's many aspects to our consciousness. There's many parts to how we perceive reality. Even throughout a day, even within a few hours, we'll start off the morning with a certain perspective, have a little coffee, have a little breakfast. Our perspective changes a little bit. The way we understand and process information and conversation and people around us changes. And so that multiplicity of experience, really honoring that. And so when, for example, someone comes into my office and says, I am depressed. I like to, after talking with them a little bit, I say I'd like to try to reframe that a little bit. There is part of you that's depressed. You were aware that part of you is depressed. You're not a walking ball of depression. That's not really who you are. But there is a part of you that puts on these depressed lenses some of the time, and you see the world through that lens. And it does color our world, whether it's anxiety, whether it's depression, whether it's trauma responses, when we're wearing those lenses of those parts, when we're blended with those parts, we do see the world differently. And it impacts and colors the way that we perceive reality. So it requires some mindfulness, and this is why I'm such a big fan of meditation, because, if we can follow our breath and really drop in with we can cultivate a spaciousness and an alertness at the same time, a concentration that's open and aware and referenceless. And so this is a real advantage, to be able to do that, just to recognize, okay, I'm in a fearful part right now, and it's just a part. I need to take a breath. I need to step back from this part. I recognize that I'm in it. I need to unblend, to decouple, and to engage that part. Hey, Christine. I need to engage that part and understand potentially where did that part originate from? Was that something I've internalized from my family of origin? Was that a traumatic experience, a car accident, or a really difficult breakup, or the death of a loved one? Where did that part come from? And understanding the parts are really just there as an adaptation in many ways to prevent us from getting hurt again. And if we can trace that back to the original root cause and give it as much love and compassion and acceptance as we can, then we don't need to blend with that part anymore, that we can be free. And when I think about what is healing, ultimately, what is freedom? How can we move gracefully from situation to situation, interaction to interaction? It's okay to feel sadness. It's okay to feel grief. It's okay to feel trauma responses coming up. And how do we not get stuck in those? How do we not solidify those and become so identified that we become immobile and not free anymore? We're shackled. And so a lot of my work, and the reason why mystical experiences are so helpful with this, occasioned mystical experiences, is that we're able to unself a little bit. We're able to step away from that separate self part or structure and take a look at it. And there's no bad parts. We're not pushing it away. We're not making it wrong or bad or trying to, get rid of it. But how do we work with it? How do we dialogue with it? How do we understand it? How do we actually go back to the root cause of why it's there in the first place? And so this is, this is sort of a graphic of all of the different compensations, some of the common compensations and parts that arise from a traumatic experience. And like I said, I'm talking about capital T trauma, like in the way that Judith Herman talked about it in Trauma and Recovery 40 years ago, where, maybe longer than that, but where, you're faced with a life-threatening situation and you have no agency. Those two factors are how trauma traditionally is defined within DSM-5, within psychology, within the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. But this understanding that something is life-threatening and that we've lost agency, we're not free, we can't do anything about it. And when that happens to somebody, and in war, physical abuse, sexual abuse, childhood abuse, all of these aspects of trauma, when that happens, because as mammals, we're wired for survival, not necessarily well-being, those traumatic memories don't just get forgotten. We're trying to make it through the day, so when alive. So when a traumatic experience happens, our amygdala and our hippocampus, the structures in our brain tied with emotion, and hold on to that. And one of the characteristics of people that are having are responding to the trauma and reacting to it still, even 10, 15, 30, 50 years later, when they're in a situation that even slightly resembles the original traumatic situation that they were in, the traumatic event, their brain doesn't think that that was 50 years ago. Their brain is telling them it's happening right now and you need to protect yourself so that this suffering does not occur again, that this pain does not happen again. And so you can see all of these compensations and these parts that can arise from that. Hypervigilance, am I safe right now? Is this okay? Is there any threat at all in the environment that I'm in right now? Alcoholism and opioid abuse, we use, I like, instead of substance use disorder, I like to say substance use disharmony, because it really is about addressing the trauma. And the substance abuse disharmony may be actually a reaction to dealing with that underlying trauma. So how do you go back and work with that? Eating disorders, somaticization, head, chronic pain and headaches, panic attacks and anxiety, shame spirals and self-hatred, startle responses, nightmares, flashbacks, irritability, depression. All of these aspects, which are sadly really quite common, they're really on some level ways that the human mammal has compensated for avoiding getting hurt again. And so we're doing our best as humans when these parts come up. So juxtaposed with this separate self-structure that's trying to remain safe in the face of previous trauma or suffering or challenges, grief and loss and pain, we also have within each of us a capital S self, which is also referred to sometimes as ego-aware process, the objective self, the self-witness. Sometimes I like to use the term embodied aware presence or just awareness. We have that going on at the same time within us. Even when we're totally activated by a traumatic memory, we still have that capital S self. It's our birthright. It's part of us, that awareness. Whether we're aware of something that has negative content or whether we're aware of something that has positive content, we're aware. Basically aware. And so with this work of working with these parts and these separate self-structures, if we can be curious about them, compassionate, confident, courageous, calm, clear, connected, and creative, and approach these responses that we've had to trauma, lowercase trauma, uppercase trauma, middle case trauma, and the sequelae from that, if we can stay in self long enough to and give our awareness, donate our awareness to engaging those parts, befriend them, and ultimately understand where they came from, that's the pathway to wholeness, because then we can start integrating and become fully everything that we are. And to learn from those parts, because often these parts that originate from trauma actually have a lot of teachings too, about creativity, about how to interact with the world, about the way people's lives unfold. So I've got a few paintings by, she's a Swedish painter, Hilma af Klint, born in 1862 in Sweden. And she was considered a spiritualist painter and artist. But, you know, the more time I spend with her work and really looking at it, you know, I see kind of the source energy, and I see the multiplicity and sort of the rainbow of personality and of aspects to our consciousness, which is vast, and that interface between the two. And, you know, maybe a heart in the middle and, you know, a helix DNA model through it. So I just think her work is really intriguing. Hilma af Klint. So this is one definition of mysticism that I want to share. Mysticism is fundamentally a mystical a priori, which means it's innate, an immediate, intuitive connection with the ultimate, the divine, which is characterized by an ecstatic experience that transcends the ordinary subject-object structure of human perception and understanding. This experience involves a unity beyond normal forms and an encounter with the holy that reveals itself as the ground of all being, permeating and transcending all existence. And, you know, one of the aspects of the mystical experience and occasioned mystical experiences, which we'll talk about, is that dissolution of subject-object split, that we are truly interconnected, and we are in a state of confusion that we don't see that, and that creates suffering for us. We're disconnected from the earth. We're disconnected from each other. Countries are disconnected from each other. And we're disconnected from ourselves often. And it's in that returning home to who we really are, our authentic self, that is the healing path. And I also want to say, and I learned this from a hospice nurse, you know, this phrase that healing is a verb, health is not a noun. Healing's a process, right? And it never ends. I have yet to meet somebody who's fully healed. I think we're all in process. We're all works in process like that. And, you know, we might, you know, move forward a little bit in our healing and becoming integrated, but there's always more to become whole again and to return home to who we truly are. It is a process. Here's some more Hilma af Klint. Again, I love this source represented by the sun. This is what I see, and then this multiplicity of colors in the rainbow spectrum. You know, like light going through a crystal, and the rainbow of light being emanated from that. So the other psychologist that I want to reference is William James, who wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience in 1902. And he suggested that mystical experiences form the core of all religious experiences. And I forget where I picked up this phrase, but I read somewhere, or somebody said once, that they thought mysticism is the antidote to fundamentalism. And I chew on that one all the time, you know? And I think about, I mean, within Christianity specifically, you know, I've heard some ministers and pastors talk about, you know, the trajectory of the great schism between Eastern Orthodoxy and Western Orthodoxy in 1052, and how we really lost the mystical in the West at that point. And then during the Reformation with Martin Luther, we've lost the ritual aspect of Christianity, which Catholicism continued, but that Protestantism in some ways did away with and focused more on the individual. And as we move away from the mysticism, which really, if we think about the history of religion, Jesus walking on water, making wine from water, Moses parting the Red Sea, talking to the burning bush, these are all descriptions of mystical experiences in direct connection with divinity. Those are really the foundational centerpiece of all religion. And then we get into doctrine and we codify things. And I think as we move further and further away from the mystical, we move more into doctrine. This is the way it is. That's not the way it is. Fundamentalism is just another step away. And we see that often in all of the religious traditions throughout the world. So I also see the importance of occasioned mystical experiences as in some ways returning to the mystical again, returning to what is our birthright, this connection with that divine spark, with that awareness, with that divinity within each of us, with that Buddha nature within each of us. So William James's work was repurposed in the early 60s, and the foundational kind of domains of it were used to develop the mystical experience questionnaire, which was used, Dr. Walter Punke and Bill Richards constructed this research tool where they used William James's work and came up with the 5 domains of what is a mystical experience, and they have a 100-question questionnaire that's often given to people after an occasioned mystical experience to see if they had that experience. And what's really interesting about this is that Anthony Boss's work at NYU, researchers at Johns Hopkins, Roland Griffiths, who died last year, but started the Center for Consciousness Studies and Occasioned Mystical Experience Studies at Johns Hopkins. These researchers noted that people who scored higher on the mystical experience questionnaire, their depression, anxiety, trauma responses went more into remission. So there was an inverse correlation between connecting with the mystical experience and depression, anxiety, and other aspects of suffering that were diminished. And a lot of that work was done with people at the end of life. So the first domain that I want to mention, and is there a timepiece that, okay, there it is, great, 8:30, perfect, 7:30. Unity consciousness, one of the hallmarks of the occasioned mystical experiences is their internal and external unity, a sense of oneness and unity with other people, nature, and the entire universe. And I want to give an example of this, a case study example. One of the nice things about Oregon is because we're the first state to have these occasioned mystical experiences be above board. People come from all over the world to Ashland. And, I see people from all over the country. I see people from Europe and from Japan, all over the world. And this was and I work with people with a lot of diverse spiritual backgrounds too, which having a minor in comparative religion is absolutely fascinating to me. How different people engage with the divine in their own spiritual life, and how personal that is, and how many similarities and differences there are, and how wonderful that is, speaking to the multiplicity of the human experience. So this was a gentleman who was Church of Latter-day Saints, was Mormon, came from Salt Lake City, to have an occasion mystical experience in a safe setting with me. And this gentleman was there was a lot of anxiety, there was a lot of fear, there was some thoughts of self-harm. He had a fairly large. He had 9 children. That he was a professional, but trying to take the stress of trying to provide for all these children and maintain his home life and his work life, and was really quite overwhelmed, and was having an increasing amount of self-harm thoughts. And so, in the preparation for this occasion, to this Om, we talked about the map of his parts, right? What aspects, where did they come from? His family of origin, his relationship with his dad, his relationship with his mom, the loss of a good friend during adolescence. And in the middle of the occasioned mystical experience, he said, "Dr. Ian, I'm really feeling overwhelmed by fear right now. I'm really, really feeling fearful in this moment." And so we sat for a moment, and I said, "Okay." I said, "Let's try something. Why don't you step to the middle of the room?" And I just want you to stand in the middle of the room and imagine that, like a clock, you're at the center of the clock, the hub, and there's 12 o'clock, there's 3 o'clock, there's 6 o'clock, there's 9 o'clock. And I want you to look around the room and name all the parts within yourself that you can see right now. And he said, "Wow, there's my fear over there at 2 o'clock. There's my anxiety right next to it at 3 o'clock. Wow, there's some joy and how much I love my wife. There's my work and work stress over at 6 o'clock. There's creativity and making music with friends." And he went around the whole circle, and he sat for a moment, and he said, it's almost like a tractor beam pull to the anxiety, to the fear. It's almost like it's really trying to pull me over to it and absorb me. And I said, "It's okay. You can see it. Let's stay in the middle of the room. It's okay. It's okay." And he was quiet for a while. And he said, "Wow, God loves all of his children. I can love all of my parts." And it was just this beautiful acknowledgement of feeling that unity consciousness, both internally with all the aspects of who he was, and feeling unity with God. It was really a beautiful moment. I'll never forget it. I also, another story about unity consciousness. This was a gentleman who came up from Texas, actually. A gay man in his late 50s, and he came up for a group occasioned mystical experience with a group of fellow travelers and journeyers. And he lived in a very, very conservative place, hometown in Texas, where he really had to be very closeted, and couldn't tell his neighbors that he was gay, and couldn't tell his co-workers at work, couldn't share that, and felt very closeted and a little bit nervous and afraid, and couldn't fully be who he was. And so during this experience, with the occasioned mystical experience, the Om, I noticed that he had a big smile on his face. And I went over and sat down next to him, and I said, what are you noticing right now? What's going on in your experience? And he said, I'm having this vision right now, which isn't new to me, but I realize it's time for me to leave Texas. And it's time for me, I want to move to the West Coast, to a more progressive city or town. But I also really love my neighbors. Even though we're really different, I love them, and I don't want to just leave. I want to have a ceremony, a close, like a party, a going away party, where everybody's invited. We have a barbecue. And then he gets this big smile on his face and he says, and I really want to dance the conga line with my right-wing conservative neighbors. Right? And anyway, I got an email appears in my mailbox a year later, and this man had taken that vision to heart and had moved to the West Coast, was in a really progressive town, and he had held that party. And they had danced the conga line, and he felt very unified with his neighbors despite their differences from him, and a feeling of intolerance. But it was just, it was such a beautiful thing. And I one of the things about doing this kind of work and people having these kinds of experiences is that I know that their healing, sends ripples into the world to the people around them. And I think that having that closing and the conga line and the barbecue with his neighbors, I mean, I imagine that probably some of them wondered if he was gay or not, but it's like, that this is human to human. We have more similarities than differences. So, noetic quality is another domain of the mystical experience. It's an experience of being in touch with the deeper truth about reality and the nature of existence, a state of knowing and insight into the depths of truth unplumbed by the discursive that comes with great authority. So really having that sort of direct understanding of your experience. This actually was a Seventh-day Adventist that I was working with, and she had a very, very, very difficult and challenged life growing up. A lot of alcoholism in her family. A lot of loss due to extreme self-harm, and people dying from alcoholism, husband, father, her brother, and had really suffered most of her life. And she had gone into and had been hospitalized for depression several times. But very, would read scripture every day and was very, very devout. And yet this depression was really, she had sort of holed up in her room and was not going out, was avoiding going anywhere, not taking care of hygiene, not taking care of herself. Her psychiatrist who contacted me was really right on the cusp of whether she needed hospitalization and commitment at that point. And so I started working with her. And over a series of treatments and really sitting with her, she started having these experiences of the scriptural readings that she had been doing that wasn't discursive. It wasn't her thinking mind that was relating to them. Her heart was. And I quote, "I feel God's love. God will not abandon me ever. God is the shepherd. When one of his herd is lost, he searches for them until they are found. He holds them close to his chest. God doesn't abandon people. He's not like people. He is all good. God doesn't want me to hurt myself. I feel God's love throughout my body, down to my toes. It feels good to feel this close to God. He will never abandon me. His love is unconditional and not partial. God is my shepherd, I shall not want," from the Psalms. And then she said, there are new pathways that are opening up in front of me. All the colors of the rainbow, the color green. These pathways are bright, light, open, colorful, big, and beautiful. I think the green one is my favorite. There's joy here now. I can feel it. The joy is released. Galatians 5:22, the fruition of the Holy Spirit, joy, peace, kindness, love, goodness. I see it. I feel it. It's all there. It was waiting to come out, to be expressed, that joy, that warmth. It's all new, a rainbow of colors. Now I feel very relaxed, big smile on her face, warmth of joy. My joy has been hidden by my depression. And just this, it was really indescribable sitting with her during that moment, and it's a little hard to convey through words how powerful that was. But as she was saying the words, it really wasn't coming up from up here. It was this direct connection that she was having, this noetic knowing of her relationship with God and the divine. And it was so moving. So 8 months later, she's going back to services every Sunday. She's out and about. She goes to visit her mother every week, and she's planning a road trip with one of her girlfriends across the country. So, but not depressed, not thinking about self-harm. She's healing, and yeah. So sacredness, a sense of awe or awesomeness, a sense of the limitations and smallness of your everyday personality in contrast to the infinite, a sense of profound humility before the majesty of what was felt to be sacred or holy, a sense of being at a spiritual height, a sense of reverence, a feeling that you experience something profoundly sacred and holy. And just for purposes of time, I just want to get to a few other things here. Deeply felt positive mood and paradoxicality. Experiences of transcendence are always accompanied by a strong positive affect. This can range from peace, serenity, and tranquility to an ecstatic rapture. Accounts of mystical experiences are also characterized by striking paradoxicality. And, that quality of being able to hold two diametrically opposing views or thoughts in our head at the same time without exploding is really hard for humans. This is why there's red and blue states. This is why there's this and that. Holding that there might be validity in both points of views and the polarity, that there's a larger whole going on. There's something incredibly healing about being able to see the world through that more holistic lens and not get caught up in positionality, but sticking with relationality with all that is. And these are aspects that an occasioned mystical experience can take us. I had a gentleman from Belgium who came, who really had a very traumatic childhood, a lot of physical abuse, and had a number of self-harm attempts and ideation, and tried to get into the military, but they wouldn't allow him to get into the military because his parents were divorced and he had been hospitalized for his depression. He ultimately moved to France and joined the French Foreign Legion. Really, with the intent of being put somewhere where his life would end, right? Really to be put in the line of fire. That was the intention with joining the French Foreign Legion. And so he came here, and and we did the preparation, we did the setup with him, and he went into his experience, and one of the things I'll just say as an aside about occasioned mystical experiences is that either they enable us, they capacitate us to let go of what we're grasping really tightly, or to be able to work with what we're trying to hide or push away from ourselves. There's a saying in this field, you've got to feel it to heal it. So nothing gets excluded. How can we work with every aspect of who we are? And this gentleman had been through a nasty divorce. He had been hospitalized a couple times, still had some ideation of self-harm. And during his occasion, his own, he went right into experiencing and reliving a lot of that hell of his early childhood, remembering vividly what his stepdad was doing to him and the way he was treated. And it was like he was almost there. But the paradoxicality and the positive mood was also happening. He said, Dr. Ian, I feel like I'm going through hell, and I know there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I know it. And I can feel my connection with the brothers in my life. I know that they are that connection is a lifeline and will always be there for me. So at the same time he's going into these experiences, which he's been pushing away for 30 plus years, he simultaneously was having this positive felt mood that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and acknowledging this deep connection and lifeline that his close relationships, a lot through his military work, had created for him and offered him. And so, he's off his antidepressants. He's back in France right now. His tour is almost ending with the French Foreign Legion, and he's out of there. He's not interested anymore in putting himself in harm's way for money, essentially. Yeah. What else do we got here? So ineffability is another important characteristic. The ineffable quality of the experience could be due to its uniqueness, the intensity of the accompanying emotion, or the inadequacy of our language to describe it. And, this is one reason why I think poetry is closer to the mystical experiences than prose is. Often silence is much closer to these experiences than any words can say. And, this discursive mind of ours is really helpful in a lot of practical ways, but the prefrontal cortex is also problematic in many ways in how it separates us from others, and that we create solidifications of things that are probably much more loose and fluid and impermanent. This is a poem by, this is a Buddhist Tibetan Lama in Ann Arbor, Michigan. His name is Trekton Khepa. His poetry, he goes by TK. And what's interesting about this guy, I've been following his poetry for about 15 years, but his mother was Jean Kirkpatrick, who was the ambassador to the United Nations and worked under Reagan. But he's a yogi in Ann Arbor and has a farm and a sangha there in Ann Arbor, Michigan. But I like this poem. Language always becomes dogma, crystallizes as knowledge, embraces the past with conservative fervor. Concept becomes an authoritarian dictator of formulated views. Silence is radical. It undoes the hegemony of archaic structures such as subject and object. Silence embraces with intimacy and allows within the anarchy of divinity. Language has its uses, getting directions to the drugstore, writing a love poem, talking with you. Language allows communication between beings. Silence is an ocean where beings swim in communion. At its best, language helps build a temple wherein the Holy of Holies, silence, dwells and bestows meaning's fullness upon appearing. Lived rightly, a human life is that temple. A human heart is that ark of the covenant. So the last domain I want to mention is the transcendence of time and space. A feeling that the experience is outside of the usual time-space boundaries, beyond past and future and eternity and infinity, or in a completely different dimension. And like I was saying earlier, that when a traumatic event happens, the hippocampus and the amygdala, we get locked in, we get frozen in time when that event happened. And so when anything even remotely akin to that experience happens, we go right back there that it's actually happening again. And this is, the kind of the proverbial example of this is when veterans who have been in firefights and war situations, might hear a car backfire on Main Street in Ashland, which is relatively a fairly safe place. They might mistake it for gunfire and take cover. Hearing that noise, it goes right into that part of the brain. I need to be safe. I need to protect myself. I'm not safe. And it's really about training that part of our brains through interconnection with the present right here, present moment, that then is not now, that you are safe right now, and that we can visit those experiences in the past without going back into that experience and reliving it. And that really is bringing us out of that trauma response, that the past is the past, the present is the present, and how do we connect those two, knowing that we're right here, right now, in the present moment. And this comes into play with a lot of occasioned mystical experiences, especially with people with trauma and traumatic memories. Being able during these experiences to go back in time and re-experience really quite vividly often, but knowing in this moment that they're safe, that they're okay, that there's nothing to be feared in this moment, and to bridge that gap. And a couple cases come to mind. One is a gentleman that actually Naoko and I worked with, and he had come out from New York City. He had lost his dad to COVID, and it was at that horrible time, during COVID, where people on ventilators were separate from their loved ones, as they were dying in the ICU. And he went back to this memory of this window. There's a big window in my office over at Hidden Springs, and he said that window reminds me of being separated from my dad. I can see my dad on the other side of that window. It was just like being separate from him. And so he was able to go back there, and he really had not had the opportunity to grieve his father's loss, and was holding on to it, and it actually had been transformed into this really intense rage toward his sibling, about about the memorial service, the open casket, these parts of the memorial that he was advocating for. His sibling was wanting the exact opposite, and they were really battling each other. The sadness had really been, it's easier to feel sad than it is angry, I think, for a lot of men in particular, but a lot of people in general. Anger is a more expressive emotion, but we have to feel the grief as well. And these occasioned mystical experiences of him transcending time and space and being able to go back to that moment where he lost his dad, tears coming down his face, really feeling that loss, remembering his father, remembering how much love there was there, and really finally being able to grieve and being in a safe enough environment with the help of transcending time and space, and to be able to go back there and see it as if it was happening was hugely healing to this man. And another example, another case that I'll share really briefly was of a gentleman that I worked with who had a lot of childhood trauma, and a lot of alcoholism in his family, and a lot of physical abuse. And this man had disconnected from his father 20 years ago, and his father subsequently died about 10 years after that, and he didn't go to the memorial. There was no closure. He just cut off all ties with him, and was still really suffering, both from the abuse, and that there had been no closure and no resolution, nothing. There was a lot of suffering going on, and a lot of alcohol use to compensate for that unexpressed grief. And so during the occasioned mystical experience, he just starts bawling, just tears, sobbing. And, so I gently asked, what are you noticing? What's happening for you right now? And he said, I can see my dad at 6 years old getting beaten by my grandfather. And he's crying, and he says, Dad, that was not right that Grandpa did that to you. No 6-year-old should ever be treated like that. That was wrong that he did that for you. And it elicited this compassion for his father's abuse at the hands of his grandfather. And, brought up all these feelings in him, and a fair amount of forgiveness and understanding. And, these are the kinds of things that are really difficult to get to with talk therapy. When we're cognitively up here and talking, and we can't really drop down into our heart, I think it's really difficult to heal these wounds. We've really got to feel it and be with it. So yeah, those are the primary dimensions of the mystical experience. And on the heels of, if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we should find in each man's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility. The power of empathy and the power of really seeing that none of us is really that different, that by and large we truly suffer in a lot of the same ways, that, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, we all want happiness, we all want to be free, we all want to live at ease, and we're all the same in that regard. And the power of empathy to disarm all hostility big fan of empathy. And, to wrap it up, Carl Rogers, the humanistic psychologist, the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. Right? And I've always loved that quote because that radical acceptance of all our parts, that integration, that movement toward wholeness as healing, that's when we begin to change. When we're trying to push things away, when we're collapsing into things, and when we're dissociating from our experience, we really get stuck and solidified with our perception of this life and our experiences. I put this slide up mainly because that last one, the transcendence of time and space, often during these occasioned mystical experiences, people can visit their ancestors. And, I've worked with, people of Jewish descent whose grandparents didn't survive the Holocaust and the trauma that they're still carrying, that their grandparents didn't resolve and the parents didn't resolve, and it gets passed on. This is the concept of intergenerational trauma, and connected with epigenetics, that traumatic experiences change our genetic structure, and it changes us on a physical level as well. But one of the advantages of being able to revisit not only your own past history, but go back and have communication with your ancestors, with your grandparents, your great-grandparents, to resolve things with them. Or, often people will be, grandma will be sitting there cheering the person on. You're doing great, keep on going, keep on doing what you're doing wonderfully. And that affirmation, I think, when there's been a loss that has been difficult and trying, is really helpful for people to have that affirmation from their ancestors like that too. And this is, this all may seem kind of foreign to us here in the 21st century, but the reality is that a lot of these aspects of the mystical experience, this was inherent in most indigenous cultures, right? That unity consciousness was there. All of these things were really, really in place. The ancestral connection, it's still it's still present in us, around us, through us. And so coming into connection with that, I think is, again, really quite healing. Well, I'll just put this up. My destination is no longer a place, rather a new way of seeing. And I think some of these occasioned mystical experiences, these ohms, it doesn't change the suffering as much as it can change our perception of suffering. And that's healing in and of itself as well. And I don't want to go too deeply into this, but my friend Rod Burney, a depth psychologist who used to live in Talent, and now he and his wife live up in Portland, or outside of Portland, he sent me this article, Chasing the Numinous, Hungry Ghosts in the Shadow of Occasioned Mystical Experiences, Renaissance. And so now Carl Jung really identified that in, post-World War II West, there was a psychological and spiritual malaise as we sort of slowly lost, organized religion was sort of falling apart, and people's spiritual connections, and more reductionism and more materialism and more alienation, which is kind of a lot of what's happening in the West right now, separation and alienation. And that we want a salve for that, we want a balm for that. And so chasing after these mystical experiences can be a way that we bypass actually working with what's here and what we need to work with. So kind of this acknowledgement that, we have to be mindful, we have to be careful. Inducing a mystical experience may not be for everybody. It's not helpful for everybody. It has to be the right person at the right time with the right intention. And so we want to be cautious, I think, and diligent in not becoming hungry ghosts, which is a reference to the Tibetan 6 realms. And the hungry ghosts are a pictorial representation. I think Gabor Mate talks about this too, but they're a pictorial representation of these creatures that have really big, insatiable bellies and mouths that are the size of a pinhole. And it's never enough. It's never enough. It's never a big enough house. It's never a nice enough car. It's not enough money. It's not enough this, that, the other. And that kind of hungry ghost that I'll never be satisfied, really. I'll never be content with what I have. That there is a caution here about occasioned mystical experiences that we aren't returning again and again, that there's a lot to digest, just in 1 or 2 of those experiences without needing to overdo it. So that's it. Yeah. Thank you. I work over at Hidden Springs, right? And yeah, it's a really great environment for this kind of work. I'm grateful. So I am open to any questions or, yeah.
About the third slide with all these people going in, they all had a blue collar on.
Yeah. I noticed that too, and I really just selected that picture just because it represented the multitude of voices, the chorus that we all have inside of us. Do this, don't do that. I don't know if that was just representative of how they're really a unity within that multiplicity. That was my first thought on that. But yeah, I noticed that. I'm not quite sure what the artist had in mind. Yeah. Yeah?
Can you maybe share briefly what, like you mentioned, you do preparation and you help your clients to experience occasional mystical experience? What are the ways or how do you work with it?
Yeah. So, I spend, 2, 3, 4 hours with preparation, separate appointments, and really get to know what they're working with and the landscape, the terrain that they're working with. And very much the model that I talked about at the beginning, what was their family of origin? What was their childhood like? What kinds of traumas, what kinds of really losses and griefs have they had in their life? How do they suffer? What is their unique flavor of suffering in this lifetime? Where do they feel most stuck, most solidified, less free, right? And understanding what the primary wounds are that they're working with, and then trying to understand the terrain of, what are the compensations that they've developed and have evolved from avoiding that primary wound from occurring again. So really getting a sense, in some ways like a mandala with the capital S self, curious and compassionate, courageous, holding center like that man did, and seeing all of his parts, but all within one unity. And being able to work with these compensations and these aspects and not making them the other or the enemy, but there are no bad parts is a slogan. And how can we start dialoguing Another form of psychology is voice dialogue, which works with these opposing points of view, with you in the middle and talking to each of these viewpoints, right? And how can you kind of meet everything? What's the middle way with all of this? But, you know, ultimately, how do we work with these primary wounds that we all have to trace some of our hopes and fears and our agendas and our separate self-complexes and compensations back to that primary wound? And then just try to bring as much love and compassion as we can to that primary wound. To not react to it, but to respond to it with love and compassion is really the healing balm, you know? And that really short circuits this need to go into a compensation, to go into a separate self-complex, but you can stay in that place of awareness and work with those parts, work with those separate self-complexes and deactivate them. You know, what was it? A client today was telling me about, who's been doing a lot of this work with me, got into a thing with his boss where he shifted his work role a little bit. And this client was saying, you know, 5 years ago, that really would have triggered me. My ego would have been really hurt by that, and I would have gotten angry and fought back. And he said, you know, I felt that for about 3 seconds, and then I realized, you know, I saw the bigger picture, and I saw the abandonment wound that ego defense was really coming from with the anger. And he said it was like a firecracker that fizzled. The fuse was lit, but it didn't explode. And he just went right back to being present with his employer and finished the conversation. Yeah, so a little bit of space. I like to joke that, you know, they're called emergency responders, not emergency reactors. Right? We don't want, you know, front care, you know, the firemen or the police to be emergency reacting to situations. We want them to be responding. You know, what is the best, most skillful means in the situation? Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
I just have to tell you, just awesome.
Oh, thank you.
Just really.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, great presentation. The whole demeanor just felt very relaxed listening to you. It was wonderful.
Sweet. Thank you. You're so welcome. Yeah, it's really, I feel so passionate about this work, and I love talking about it. You know, I truly do think that mysticism is the antidote to fundamentalism. And I think if we could come into contact with those aspects of ourselves, the world would be a healthier place, a less violent place. Yeah?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.